A school bus driver refuses to let an 8-year-old child off at his stop after noticing a suspicious car waiting. When she drives straight to the police station, the investigation reveals the child's stepfather had sold him to strangers. The amber glow of October sunlight filtered through the windshield of Bus 47 as Patricia O'Brien adjusted her rearview mirror for the third time that afternoon. At 52, Patty had driven these same streets for 15 years, watching neighborhoods change, children grow up, and seasons cycle through their predictable dance. The worn leather seat beneath her had molded perfectly to her frame, and the diesel engine's familiar rumble was as comforting as a heartbeat. Her hands, weathered from years of gripping steering wheels and opening stubborn bus doors, rested confidently on the oversized wheel. Silver rings caught the afternoon light, her late husband Michael's wedding band, which she had worn on her right hand since his passing 3 years ago, and a simple Celtic knot ring her daughter had given her for Christmas. The dashboard before her was a landscape of familiar controls and personal touches. A small photo of her grandchildren tucked into the corner of the speedometer, a travel mug with "World's Best Bus Driver" emblazoned in fading letters. In the third row on the right side sat 8-year-old Jack Sullivan, clutching his worn Star Wars backpack like a shield. His unruly brown hair seemed to defy any attempt at styling, and his bright green eyes, which had once sparkled with curiosity when he first joined her route 3 months ago, now seemed distant and troubled. The backpack had seen better days. One corner was frayed, and she could see where someone had carefully mended a tear with duct tape. A Millennium Falcon keychain hung from the main zipper, its paint worn smooth from countless small fingers. When Jack had first started riding Bus 47, he had been full of questions about everything. How fast did the bus go? How many gallons of gas did it hold? Why were school buses yellow instead of blue or red? He had been the kind of child who found wonder in mechanical details and delighted in sharing random facts he had learned from library books. But over the past few weeks, that curious, talkative boy had been replaced by someone quieter, more withdrawn. The questions had stopped coming. Patty had noticed other changes too, small details that her experienced eye caught even when Jack tried to hide them. There had been a bruise on his upper arm 2 weeks ago, visible when his t-shirt sleeve had ridden up as he climbed aboard. When she had asked about it, he had mumbled something about falling off his bike. But the shape had been wrong, too precise, too much like finger marks. A few days later, she had spotted what looked like a healing cut on his lower lip, which he claimed had happened when he bit down too hard on a sandwich. Most troubling of all were the conversations she had overheard him having with himself, barely audible whispers that seemed to be practicing explanations for things. "I fell down the stairs," she had heard him murmur once. "I was running and didn't see the door. I'm just clumsy." The words had chilled her because they sounded rehearsed, like lines from a play he had been forced to memorize. The bus rounded the corner onto Elm Street, where mature oak trees formed a canopy overhead, their leaves painted in brilliant shades of orange and gold. This was one of Millbrook's older neighborhoods, where Victorian houses sat on generous lots and residents still knew their neighbors' names. It was the kind of place where children rode bicycles without helmets and parents trusted that community watchfulness would keep their little ones safe. Behind Jack sat 10-year-old Emma Rodriguez with dark braids tied with yellow ribbons, already gathering her purple backpack as they approached her stop on Maple Street. There was also 12-year-old Nathan Thompson in the back row, absorbed in his handheld gaming device despite the no electronics rule she had long since given up enforcing. Sisters Lucy and Grace Wilson sat together in their usual spot, fourth row on the left, whispering about something that made them giggle intermittently. "Next stop, Maple Street," Patty called out in her clear, practiced voice, watching Emma move toward the front with careful steps. She brought the vehicle to its customary gentle stop, the air brakes releasing with their signature hiss. "Have a good evening, sweetheart," Patty said as Emma descended the steps. "Tell your mama I said hello." "I will, Miss Patty," Emma replied with a gap-toothed grin before skipping toward her family's modest 2-story home, where her grandmother waited on the front porch, waving enthusiastically. As Bus 47 pulled away from the curb, Patty's eyes automatically swept the interior through her rearview mirror. 15 children remained aboard now, and her attention kept returning to Jack Sullivan. She had grown accustomed to seeing his stepfather, George Morrison, waiting by the mailbox at 47 Elm Street. George was a tall, thin man in his early 40s with prematurely graying hair and hands that always seemed to be fidgeting with something. Car keys, loose change, his cell phone. He had struck Patty as nervous from their first meeting, but she had attributed it to the awkwardness of being a new stepfather trying to establish routines. George's nervousness had not diminished over time. If anything, he had appeared to grow more agitated as the weeks passed. His smiles seemed forced, and his conversations with Jack were awkward, filled with stilted dialogue that suggested they were both following a script neither had fully memorized. But George had always been punctual, always visible, standing by the mailbox at exactly 3:47 when bus 47 arrived. Jack's stop was approaching 47 Elm Street, a pale yellow house with white trim and a wraparound porch that spoke of better times. The house had the slightly worn look of a place that had been loved but perhaps not always carefully maintained. Paint was beginning to peel around the window frames, and the front steps showed the sag that came from decades of use. "Jack, honey, we're almost at your stop," Patty called out gently, watching the boy in her mirror. Instead of the usual acknowledgement, a nod or a quiet, "Okay, Miss Patty," Jack seemed to shrink deeper into his seat. His knuckles were white where they gripped his backpack straps, and Patty noticed his eyes darting toward the window with what looked suspiciously like fear. As the bus approached the familiar yellow house, Patty's eyes swept the area with automatic vigilance. The mailbox stood empty, no George Morrison waiting with his characteristic restless energy. That was odd. In 3 months, he had never missed meeting the bus. Even during the brief thunderstorm 2 weeks ago, he had stood under the covered porch, but he was always visible, always watching. But it was not George's absence that made Patty's stomach clench with sudden unease. It was the black sedan with heavily tinted windows parked directly across the street from Jack's house. The car was expensive-looking, maybe a BMW or Mercedes, with the kind of sleek lines that spoke of serious money. Its paint was so dark it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and the windows were tinted far beyond what Massachusetts law typically allowed. Most telling of all, the engine was running. She could see the faint shimmer of exhaust in the cool autumn air. 2 figures sat in the front seats, their faces completely obscured by the dark glass, but their attention was clearly focused on her bus with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Patty had transported children long enough to develop what she privately called her mother radar, an instinctive sense for when something was not right. That radar was now screaming warnings so loudly she was surprised the children on the bus could not hear them. "Miss Patty?" came Jack's small voice from behind her, barely above a whisper. "Miss Patty, are we stopping?" She turned to look at Jack directly, seeing him pressed against the window on the opposite side from his house. His face was pale, drained of healthy color. There was something in his expression that she had seen before in children who were genuinely frightened. Not the dramatic fear of a scary movie, but the deep, quiet terror that came from real danger. "Jack," she said softly, her hand moving instinctively to the door control lever, but not yet pulling it. "Is everything all right, sweetheart?" The boy's eyes flicked toward the black car, then back to her face, and in that glance she saw confirmation of her own fears. He knew about the car. He had been expecting it, and the knowledge terrified him. For a moment, she thought he might speak, might tell her what was making him look like a rabbit caught in headlights. Instead, he shook his head almost imperceptibly and whispered, "I don't want to get off today." The words hit Patty like a physical blow. In 15 years of driving school buses, she had never heard a child sound genuinely afraid to get off the bus at his own house. The fear in Jack's voice was real and deep, the kind that came from knowledge rather than imagination. The other children on the bus were beginning to grow restless. "Come on, Jack," called out Nathan from the back. "Some of us want to get home." "Yeah, my mom's making spaghetti tonight," added Grace Wilson. "I'm starving." But Patty was not listening to their complaints. She was watching Jack's face, seeing the way his chest rose and fell with rapid, shallow breaths, the way his hands trembled slightly as they clutched his backpack. She was also watching the black sedan in her peripheral vision, noting how neither occupant had moved since she had arrived, how they seemed to be waiting for something or someone. In her 15 years of driving school buses, Patricia O'Brien had transported over 10,000 children safely to their destinations. She had dealt with everything from bee stings to broken bones, from playground bullies to family emergencies. She had learned to trust her instincts about children, about danger, about the subtle signs that something was not as it should be. George Morrison was nowhere to be seen. Jack Sullivan was terrified. And two strangers in an expensive car were sitting outside his house with their engine running, watching her bus with an intensity that made her skin crawl. The decision crystallized in her mind with startling clarity. Whatever was supposed to happen at this stop, she was not going to let it happen. Not on her watch. Not to one of her kids. "All right, everyone," she announced, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Change of plans. We need to make an important stop before I can take you all home." "What kind of stop?" asked Lucy Wilson, leaning forward in her seat with curiosity. "An important one," Patty repeated, her foot pressing down on the accelerator as Bus 47 pulled away from the curb without opening its doors. In her mirror, she saw Jack's shoulders sag with what looked like relief, and she knew with absolute certainty that she had made the right choice. Behind them, she caught a glimpse of the black sedan's occupants stirring, and she watched as the car pulled away from the curb as well, falling into line several vehicles behind her bus. Her hands tightened on the steering wheel, but her course remained steady. "Miss Patty." Jack's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried clearly in the sudden quiet that had fallen over the bus. "Where are we going?" She met his eyes in the rearview mirror, seeing a flicker of hope beginning to kindle in those frightened green depths. It was the first time in weeks that he had looked directly at her. "Somewhere safe, honey," she said, her voice carrying all the conviction and protection that 15 years of caring for children had taught her. "Somewhere very safe." The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the streets of Millbrook as Bus 47 changed course, its yellow bulk moving with purpose through the quiet suburban landscape. In the third row, Jack Sullivan allowed himself to breathe for what felt like the first time in weeks, while behind them, the black sedan continued its careful pursuit, its occupants now reaching for their cell phones to make urgent calls. The radio crackled to life on her dashboard, the dispatcher's voice cutting through the gentle hum of conversation behind her. "Bus 47, please respond. We've got a concerned parent calling about a missed stop on Elm Street." Patty reached for the radio with one hand while maintaining her steady course with the other. "This is Bus 47, she said calmly. "I'm handling a safety situation. We'll provide details shortly." "Copy that, Bus 47. Do you need assistance?" She glanced once more at Jack in her mirror, seeing him watching her with a mixture of fear and growing trust. "Yes," she said into the radio. "I believe I do." The other children on the bus had grown quiet, sensing that something significant was happening even if they did not understand what. Nathan had put away his gaming device. The Wilson sisters had stopped their whispering. They watched their familiar route change, watched Miss Patty's face in the rearview mirror, and felt the strange electricity that fills the air when ordinary people are called upon to do extraordinary things. As Bus 47 continued its unscheduled journey through the streets of Millbrook, Massachusetts, the afternoon light grew softer. In the distance, the spire of the Millbrook police station was becoming visible, rising above the tree line like a beacon of safety in a suddenly uncertain world. The building was red brick with white trim, built in the 1960s when the town had grown large enough to need its own police force. Patricia O'Brien did not know exactly what she was driving toward, but she knew with absolute certainty what she was driving away from. And sometimes, in the life of a school bus driver charged with protecting the precious cargo in her care, that knowledge was enough to make even the most extraordinary decision feel like the most natural thing in the world. As they drew closer to their destination, Patty felt a sense of rightness settle over her. She might not know all the details of what Jack Sullivan was facing, but she knew fear when she saw it, and she knew that her job, her calling, was to keep children safe. Everything else could be sorted out later by people with badges and training and the authority to make things right. The black sedan had fallen back further, but it was still following, its occupants undoubtedly trying to figure out how to salvage whatever plan had just been disrupted by one alert bus driver and her unshakable commitment to the children in her care. Whatever George Morrison had arranged, whatever those men in the sedan had been planning, it was not going to happen today. Not while Patricia O'Brien had anything to say about it. The police station grew larger ahead of them, its parking lot visible now through the trees. Jack Sullivan sat quietly in the third row, his Star Wars backpack still clutched in his lap, but his breathing had steadied. For the first time in weeks, someone had chosen to protect him, and that knowledge was beginning to chase away the fear that had been his constant companion. The yellow school bus pulled into the Millbrook police station parking lot with the grinding sound of air brakes and the gentle sway that marked the end of an unusual journey. The red brick building stood solid and reassuring against the backdrop of October maples, its American flag snapping crisp in the afternoon breeze. Patricia O'Brien turned off the engine, and the sudden silence felt heavy with possibility and fear. "Why are we at the police station?" asked Lucy Wilson from her seat, her voice carrying the curious concern that children reserve for unexpected detours from routine. "Are we in trouble?" whispered her younger sister Grace, clutching a notebook covered with horse stickers against her chest. Patty turned in her seat to face the remaining 15 children, her weathered hands still trembling slightly from the adrenaline that had carried her through the past 10 minutes. Behind them, through the rear window, she could see the black sedan had pulled into a parking space across the street, its occupants now visible as dark silhouettes against the tinted glass. "Nobody's in trouble," she said, her voice carrying the calm authority that had guided thousands of children through minor crises over the years. "But I need everyone to stay on the bus for just a few minutes while I talk to someone inside. Okay? Miss Patty," came Jack's voice from the third row, stronger now than it had been at his house but still threaded with uncertainty. "Thank you." The simple words carried a weight that made Patty's chest tighten with emotion. She had been right to trust her instincts. Whatever had been waiting for Jack Sullivan at 47 Elm Street, it had not been safety. "You don't need to thank me, honey," she replied, meeting his green eyes in the rearview mirror. "You just sit tight. I'm going to get some help." As Patty descended the bus steps, her legs felt unsteady beneath her. 15 years of routine had not prepared her for this moment. The transition from bus driver to protector, from following procedures to making decisions that could change a child's life. The autumn air was crisp against her face, carrying the scent of wood smoke from someone's chimney and the earthy smell of fallen leaves. The police station's front doors were heavy glass and steel, designed to project authority and safety. As they slid open with a mechanical whisper, Patty found herself in a lobby that smelled of coffee and industrial cleaning supplies. The walls were painted in calming beige tones, decorated with community service awards and photos of local events. A wooden bench sat against one wall, its surface worn smooth by countless citizens who had come seeking help or justice. Behind the reception desk sat Officer Jennifer Walsh, a woman in her early 30s with kind brown eyes and auburn hair pulled back in a regulation bun. She looked up from her computer screen as Patty approached, her expression shifting from routine politeness to genuine concern as she took in the older woman's obvious distress. "Can I help you?" Officer Walsh asked, her voice carrying the professional warmth that good police officers cultivated for dealing with civilians in crisis. "I'm Patricia O'Brien. I drive bus 47 for the school district," Patty began, her words coming faster than she intended. "I have a situation with one of my children and I think he might be in danger." Officer Walsh was already reaching for a pen and incident report form, her training kicking in automatically. "What kind of danger? Is the child injured?" "Not physically, not that I can see," Patty said, glancing back toward the parking lot where her bus sat like a yellow beacon of safety. "But there were men waiting for him. Strange men in a car, and his stepfather wasn't there like usual, and the boy was terrified. He begged me not to let him off the bus." "How old is the child?" 8. Jack Sullivan. "He lives at 47 Elm Street with his mother and stepfather, George Morrison." Patty's hands twisted together as she spoke, silver rings catching the fluorescent light. "Something's been wrong for weeks. I should have said something sooner, but I thought maybe it was just adjustment problems. You know? New family situation." Officer Walsh was writing rapidly, her pen moving across the form with practiced efficiency. What kind of things made you think something was wrong? The question opened a floodgate of observations that Patty had been storing unconsciously for weeks. Bruises that didn't look like playground accidents. A cut on his lip that he couldn't explain properly. He's been practicing excuses under his breath. I've heard him whispering things like, I fell down the stairs and I'm just clumsy. He used to be such a chatty little boy, always asking questions, but lately he's been withdrawn and scared. And today there was a black sedan with tinted windows parked across from his house. 2 men inside, engine running, just waiting. George Morrison, that's his stepfather, is always there to meet the bus. Always. But today he was nowhere to be seen, and Jack. Patty's voice broke slightly. Jack looked at that car and I could see he knew what it meant. He was terrified. Officer Walsh set down her pen and reached for her radio. Dispatch, I need Detective Hayes to the front desk immediately. We have a possible child endangerment situation. While they waited, Patty found herself studying the community photographs on the walls. Millbrook appeared to be the kind of place where police officers coached little league teams and attended school fundraisers. There was a photo of last year's Halloween parade, another of the annual summer festival. It was the sort of community where people looked out for each other, where a school bus driver's concern would be taken seriously rather than dismissed as overprotectiveness. Detective Rachel Hayes emerged from a hallway marked investigations within 3 minutes of the call. She was a tall woman in her late 30s with short-cropped blonde hair and intelligent gray eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Her navy blazer was professional but approachable, and she moved with the confident stride of someone accustomed to handling crises. Mrs. O'Brien, I'm Detective Hayes, she said, extending a firm handshake. I understand you have concerns about one of the children on your bus route. Jack Sullivan, Patty repeated, feeling somewhat calmer now that she was talking to someone with the authority to act. 8 years old, lives on Elm Street. Detective, I've been driving school buses for 15 years, and I've never seen a child as frightened as he was today. Something is very wrong in that house. Detective Hayes nodded, her expression growing more serious as Patty recounted the day's events and her weeks of growing concerns. The detective asked pointed questions about Jack's behavior, about George Morrison's demeanor, about the black sedan and its occupants. Where is Jack now? Detective Hayes asked. On my bus in the parking lot. I told the children to stay put while I came inside. Patty glanced toward the windows, reassuring herself that bus 47 was still there, still protecting its precious cargo. I'd like to speak with him if that's all right, and I want to get a formal statement from you about everything you've observed. Detective Hayes was already moving toward the door. Let's start by making sure Jack feels safe. They walked across the parking lot together, Patty's keys jingling softly in the afternoon air. The black sedan was still visible across the street, its occupants apparently content to wait and watch. Detective Hayes noted its position with a glance but made no move toward it yet. Jack, Patty called softly as she climbed back onto the bus. There's someone here who wants to talk with you. This is Detective Hayes, and she's here to help. Detective Hayes followed Patty up the bus steps, her presence immediately changing the atmosphere. The children looked at her with the mixture of curiosity and respect that most kids reserved for police officers. Her badge was visible on her belt, along with the other tools of her profession, but her demeanor was gentle and non-threatening. Hi, Jack, Detective Hayes said, moving slowly down the aisle toward the third row. Miss Patty tells me you've been having some concerns about going home today. Would you mind talking with me about that? Jack's green eyes were wide as he looked up at the detective, but there was something in her calm manner that seemed to reassure him. He glanced at Patty, who nodded encouragingly, then back at Detective Hayes. Are you going to make me go home? He asked, his voice small but clear. Not until we figure out what's been worrying you, Detective Hayes replied, settling into the seat across from him. Miss Patty says you seemed scared when you saw a car near your house. Can you tell me about that? For a moment, Jack was silent, his hand still clutching his Star Wars backpack. The other children on the bus had grown quiet, sensing the gravity of the conversation even if they didn't understand its full implications. "George has been talking to men," Jack said finally, his words coming slowly and carefully. "They come to the house at night sometimes, after I'm supposed to be asleep. But I hear them talking about money, and about how some kids get to go live with new families who can give them better things." Detective Hayes felt a chill run down her spine, but she kept her expression neutral and encouraging. "What else did you hear them say?" "George owes people money. A lot of money. He gets scared when the phone rings, and sometimes he yells at Mama about bills." Jack's voice grew smaller. "Last week, after Mama left to take care of Grandma, George told me that some special people might want to meet me. He said they could give me opportunities that Mama and him couldn't." "Where is your Mama now, Jack?" "She went to Florida to take care of Grandma who's really sick. She's been gone a week." Tears were beginning to form in Jack's eyes. "George said she might not come back for a long time, and that maybe it would be better if I went to live with people who really wanted a little boy." Patty felt her heart breaking as she listened to Jack's words. The manipulation, the grooming, the way George Morrison had been preparing this child for abandonment. It was worse than she had imagined. "Jack," Detective Hayes said gently, "you said you heard George talking to men about money. Did he ever say how much money?" The boy nodded miserably. "I heard him say $50,000. He said that would fix all his problems and give me a better life at the same time." Jack's voice dropped to a whisper. "He said Mama didn't need to know until it was too late." The words hung in the air like a physical weight. Detective Hayes exchanged a meaningful look with Patty, both women understanding the full horror of what they were hearing. This wasn't a case of domestic abuse or neglect. This was human trafficking, the sale of a child to the highest bidder. "Jack, you've been very brave to tell us this," Detective Hayes said, her voice steady despite the anger she felt building inside her. "And Miss Patty was very smart to bring you here instead of letting you get off the bus today." "Those men in the car," Jack said, looking toward the window. "They were supposed to take me somewhere. I heard George on the phone this morning. He said, 'The package will be ready for pickup at 4 o'clock. The clinical language, package, pickup, made Patty feel sick. How could anyone refer to a child, to sweet Jack Sullivan with his worn backpack and his curiosity about the world, as a package to be delivered? "Detective," Patty said quietly, "what happens now?" "Now we make sure Jack is safe," Detective Hayes replied, standing up from the bus seat. "And then we have some very serious conversations with George Morrison and his associates." She turned to address the other children on the bus, who had been listening with wide eyes and growing understanding that something very serious was happening. "I need all of you to understand that what you've heard today is very important and very private. Jack has shown a lot of courage by talking to us, and I need you all to show courage too by keeping this conversation just between us for now. Can you do that?" The children nodded solemnly, their young faces reflecting the gravity of the situation. They might not understand all the details, but they understood that their friend Jack had been in danger, and that the adults around them were working to keep him safe. "Miss Patty," Detective Hayes continued, "I'm going to need you to call your dispatcher and let them know that your bus will be out of service for the rest of the afternoon. These children will need alternative transportation home, and Jack will be staying here while we sort this situation out." "Of course," Patty replied, already reaching for her radio. "Whatever you need." As Detective Hayes escorted Jack off the bus and into the police station, Patty watched through the windshield and felt a profound sense of relief mixed with anger. Relief that Jack was now under the protection of people with the authority and training to help him. Anger that an 8-year-old child had been put in a position where he needed such protection from the very people who should have been keeping him safe. The black sedan across the street started its engine and pulled away as Jack disappeared into the police station. Its occupants had apparently realized that their carefully laid plans had been disrupted by an alert bus driver and a frightened child's courage to speak the truth. Inside the station, Jack Sullivan sat in a child-friendly interview room painted in soft blues and greens, with toys and books scattered on low tables. Detective Hayes sat across from him, her notebook open but her attention focused entirely on the boy in front of her. "Jack," she said gently, I want you to know that you're safe now. No one is going to make you go anywhere you don't want to go. But I need to ask you some more questions so we can make sure other children are safe too. Is that okay?" Jack nodded, his green eyes more alert now than they had been in weeks. For the first time since his mother had left for Florida, he felt like an adult was actually listening to him, actually believing what he had to say. "Tell me more about these men who came to visit George," Detective Hayes prompted. "Did you ever see them clearly?" "One of them had a big gold ring and talked really loud," Jack said, his memory becoming clearer as his fear subsided. "The other one was skinnier and kept checking his phone. They always parked in the driveway so the neighbors wouldn't see their car." "Did George ever mention their names?" "He called the loud one Mr. Vincent. I don't know the other one's name." Jack paused, thinking. They brought papers sometimes. George would sign things, and then they would give him money. Detective Hayes felt pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to fall into place. A trafficking ring that operated through financial desperation, that targeted vulnerable families and used debt as leverage to acquire children. It was sophisticated, organized, and utterly ruthless. "Jack, you've been incredibly helpful," she said, closing her notebook and leaning forward. "I want you to know that what George was planning was wrong. Very wrong. Adults are supposed to protect children, not hurt them. And what you did today, being brave enough to tell Miss Patty and me the truth, that probably saved not just you but other children too." For the first time in weeks, Jack Sullivan smiled. It was a small smile, tentative and fragile, but it was real. He was beginning to understand that the fear he had been living with was not his fault, and that there were adults in the world who would fight to protect him. Outside the interview room, Detective Hayes gathered her team. They had a trafficking ring to dismantle, a stepfather to arrest, and a mother in Florida who needed to be contacted immediately. But first, they had a child to protect and a community to serve. The afternoon sun was beginning to set over Millbrook, casting long shadows across the police station parking lot, where Bus 47 sat empty, its job of protection complete. Patricia O'Brien had returned home, her routine forever changed by one moment of moral courage. And in the interview room, Jack Sullivan began the long process of healing, surrounded by adults who understood that some things, like the safety of children, were worth any amount of disruption to the normal order of things. Detective Rachel Hayes sat at her desk in the Millbrook Police Department, surrounded by a growing collection of files, photographs, and evidence that painted a disturbing picture of George Morrison's descent into desperation. The fluorescent lights overhead cast harsh shadows across the documents spread before her, each piece of paper representing another step down a path that had led to the attempted sale of an 8-year-old boy. Her coffee had grown cold hours ago, but she barely noticed, too absorbed in piecing together the web of corruption and exploitation that had nearly claimed Jack Sullivan. It had been 4 hours since Patricia O'Brien had driven Bus 47 into their parking lot, and in that time, the investigation had exploded into something far larger than a simple case of child endangerment. What had started as one bus driver's protective instincts had uncovered a sophisticated trafficking network that reached across state lines and involved more children than Hayes wanted to contemplate. Her desk was now the command center for what promised to be one of the largest criminal investigations in Millbrook's history. The evidence was mounting with each phone call, each database search, each piece of documentation that painted George Morrison not as the struggling stepfather he appeared to be, but as a desperate man who had crossed lines that most people couldn't even imagine approaching. The transformation from concerned parent to child trafficker hadn't happened overnight. It had been a gradual slide facilitated by addiction, debt, and the predatory instincts of people who made their living exploiting human desperation. "Detective," called Officer Tom Bradley from across the bullpen, holding up a stack of papers thick enough to choke a horse. His usually cheerful demeanor had been replaced by the grim focus that serious crimes demanded, and his tie was loosened after hours of intensive work. "The financial records from Morrison's bank came through. You're going to want to see this, and you're probably going to want something stronger than coffee when you do." Hayes looked up from the computer screen where she had been reviewing George Morrison's criminal background check for the third time, hoping to find something she had missed that might provide additional insight into his psychology. Clean record, not even a traffic ticket in the past 5 years. On paper, he appeared to be exactly what Linda Sullivan thought she had married. A stable, responsible man who could provide security for her and her son. The reality was proving to be far more sinister than anything Linda could have imagined when she said, "I do 18 months ago." Officer Bradley approached her desk, carrying not just bank records but also what appeared to be credit reports, loan applications, and a collection of other financial documents that had been faxed over from various institutions. At 28, Bradley was the youngest detective on the force, but his attention to detail and persistence in following paper trails had already earned him respect from veteran officers who had learned to appreciate thoroughness over flash. "Morrison's been bleeding money for 8 months, Bradley said, spreading the bank statements across Hayes's desk like a poker player revealing a losing hand. "Look at these cash withdrawals. 500 here, 1,000 there, always in round numbers, always at ATMs near known gambling establishments. Classic addiction pattern, textbook progression from occasional betting to full-blown compulsive gambling." Hayes traced her finger down the columns of debits, watching George Morrison's financial life spiral into chaos with the mathematical precision of compound interest working in reverse. His salary as a warehouse supervisor at Millbrook Industrial Supply had been steady at $62,000 a year, not wealthy, but sufficient for a modest lifestyle in a town where the cost of living was reasonable. But the withdrawals showed a man chasing losses with increasingly desperate bets, each failed wager leading to larger stakes in a futile attempt to break even. "Here's where it gets interesting," Bradley continued, flipping to a statement from 2 months ago and pointing to a line item that made Hayes's stomach clench. "See this deposit? $25,000. Cash. Deposited the same day he made the largest withdrawal we've seen. $15,000 to something called Atlantic City Gaming Associates. Down payment," Hayes murmured, feeling sick as she understood the implication. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental. He got $25,000 up front for Jack, then immediately used most of it to try to win back his losses. Jesus Christ, Tom. He sold his stepson and then gambled away most of the money the same day. Gets worse. Look at the memo line on this check from 3 weeks ago. Bradley pointed to a handwritten notation that made Hayes's blood run cold. Final arrangements v. Torino. The casual way the transaction had been documented, as if it were a payment for landscaping or home repairs rather than the sale of a human child, spoke to a level of moral disconnect that Hayes found almost incomprehensible. George Morrison had not simply made a desperate decision in a moment of panic. He had planned this transaction, negotiated the terms, and documented it in his personal records, as if Jack were a piece of property to be transferred, rather than a living, breathing child with thoughts and fears and dreams. Hayes leaned back in her chair, the weight of evidence beginning to form a clear picture of systematic exploitation. Vincent Torino. Jack mentioned a Mr. Vincent who came to the house. "Bradley, I want you to run everything we have on Vincent Torino through the federal databases. If he's involved in trafficking, the FBI will have a file on him. And I want you to cross-reference any associates, known aliases, vehicle registrations, everything." While Bradley headed to his computer terminal, Hayes turned her attention to the interview notes from her conversation with Jack, reviewing them for details that might have seemed insignificant at the time, but could now provide crucial leads. The boy's account had been remarkably detailed for an 8-year-old, but she had learned over the years that children often remembered traumatic events with startling clarity. Their minds, not yet trained to dismiss uncomfortable truths or rationalize away disturbing realities, absorbed and retained information that adults might overlook or subconsciously edit. According to Jack, the conversations he had overheard painted a picture of systematic exploitation that went far beyond George Morrison's individual desperation. This had not been a spur-of-the-moment decision driven by a single financial crisis. The grooming process had begun months before Linda Sullivan left for Florida, with George gradually preparing Jack for the idea that he might be better off with a different family. The timing of Linda's departure had not been coincidental. It had been orchestrated to provide George with the unsupervised access he needed to complete the transaction. The psychological manipulation involved was as disturbing as the financial aspects. George had systematically undermined Jack's sense of security and belonging, planting seeds of doubt about his mother's love and his place in their family. He had presented the trafficking as an opportunity rather than an abandonment, framing Jack's sale as a generous act that would benefit everyone involved. The sophistication of this approach suggested coaching from people who understood how to break down a child's natural resistance to separation from family. Hayes picked up her phone and dialed the number for Linda Sullivan that Jack had provided, noting that it was a Florida area code. The phone rang several times before a tired voice answered, carrying the exhausted tone of someone who had been sitting by a hospital bed for days. "Hello, Mrs. Sullivan. This is Detective Rachel Hayes with the Millbrook Police Department in Massachusetts. I'm calling about your son, Jack." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that Hayes began to worry they had been disconnected. When Linda Sullivan finally spoke, her voice carried the hollow exhaustion of someone who had been expecting bad news for so long that its arrival felt almost like relief. "Is he hurt? Oh God. What happened? I knew I shouldn't have left him with George, but Mama was dying and I didn't have a choice, and George said he could handle it, that it would be good for them to bond, and I thought maybe if they had time alone together they might finally connect the way I always hoped they would." The words came in a rush, the desperate justifications of a mother who had been wrestling with guilt over leaving her child with a man who, while legally her husband, was still essentially a stranger to her son. Hayes could hear hospital sounds in the background, the beeping of monitors, the quiet conversations of medical staff, the institutional hum of a place where people went to fight death. "Mrs. Sullivan," Hayes interrupted gently, "Jack is safe. He's here at the police station, and he's not injured. But we need to talk about your husband's activities while you've been away." "George isn't his father," Linda said quickly, a defensive note creeping into her voice that spoke to months of explaining their family situation to teachers, neighbors, and well-meaning relatives. "I mean, he's my husband, but he's Jack's stepfather. They're still getting used to each other. Jack's real father died when he was 3, and it's been hard for him to accept George. Has there been some kind of accident? Did Jack run away? I've been so worried about leaving him, but Mama only has days left, maybe hours, and I couldn't abandon her." Hayes chose her words carefully, aware that she was about to shatter this woman's world in ways that would reverberate for years to come. "Mrs. Sullivan, we have reason to believe that your husband was planning to harm Jack. We intercepted what appears to have been an attempt to remove him from your home without your consent." The sound that came through the phone was not quite a scream, but something rawer and more primal. The noise a mother makes when she realizes her child has been in mortal danger while she was powerless to protect him. It was followed by a crash, as if Linda had dropped the phone or knocked something over. "What do you mean, remove him? George wouldn't hurt Jack. He's been trying so hard to be a good stepfather." "Sure, they haven't connected the way I hoped, and sometimes George gets frustrated because Jack can be difficult about accepting him, but George loves him. He told me he loves him. He said he wanted to be the father Jack never had." The desperate quality in Linda Sullivan's voice reminded Hayes of other cases where family members struggled to accept that someone they trusted had committed unthinkable acts. The human mind's capacity for denial when faced with betrayal by loved ones was both understandable and heartbreaking. "Mrs. Sullivan, we have evidence that your husband has been in contact with individuals involved in human trafficking. Based on conversations Jack overheard and financial records we've obtained, we believe George was planning to sell Jack to these individuals." The silence this time was complete and lasted so long that Hayes began to count her own heartbeats. She could hear Linda Sullivan's breathing becoming rapid and shallow, the sound of someone processing information that fundamentally challenged everything they believed about their life and the people in it. "You're wrong. You have to be wrong. George wouldn't. He couldn't." Linda's voice broke, and Hayes could hear her beginning to sob. Oh God, the questions he asked before I left. He wanted to know exactly when I'd be back, how long I thought Mama had left, whether anyone else knew where I was staying. He asked about Jack's birth certificate, his social security card, his medical records. I thought he was just worried about managing alone with Jack, about what to do if there was an emergency. "Mrs. Sullivan, I need you to listen to me carefully. Jack is safe, but we're going to need you to return to Massachusetts as soon as possible. There are going to be legal proceedings, and Jack is going to need his mother more than he's ever needed anyone in his life. I can't leave Mama. She's dying, She could go any day, and I'm all she has left. The doctors said it could be hours, could be days, but not long. How can I choose between my dying mother and my son who's been? Linda's voice dissolved into sobs again. Hayes understood the impossible position this put Linda Sullivan in, torn between a dying mother and a son who had nearly been sold into trafficking. It was exactly the kind of situation that predators like George Morrison counted on. Family crises that isolated potential victims and created opportunities for exploitation. Is there anyone else who could stay with your mother? A relative? A family friend? Someone from your church? My cousin Marie lives about an hour away. She could probably... Jesus, I can't believe this is happening. How did I not see it? How did I marry someone who could do this to my baby? What kind of mother leaves her child with a monster and doesn't even realize it? The self-recrimination in Linda Sullivan's voice was painful to hear, but Hayes had seen it before in cases involving family betrayal. Parents, especially mothers, often blamed themselves for failing to recognize threats within their own homes, as if love should have provided them with supernatural insight into the hearts of the people they trusted. Mrs. Sullivan, there was no way you could have known. Traffickers specifically target vulnerable families, and they're skilled at appearing trustworthy. People like your husband are often charming, helpful, and seemingly devoted family members. That's how they gain access to children in the first place. Your priority now needs to be getting back here to support Jack. I'll drive through the night. I can be there by tomorrow afternoon if I leave now. I'll call Marie, and she can sit with Mama. God, I hope Mama dies before I have to tell her what George tried to do to Jack. It would break her heart. Linda's voice was growing stronger, focusing on action rather than guilt. Can I talk to him? Can I talk to Jack? I need to hear his voice. I need to know he's really okay. Of course. Let me transfer you to the family services room where he's waiting. Hayes walked down the hallway to where Jack sat with Maria Santos, a child services specialist who had arrived 2 hours earlier. Maria was a woman in her early 40s with kind eyes and the patient demeanor that came from years of helping traumatized children navigate crises that no child should have to face. The room was designed to be comforting for children in crisis, with soft colors and comfortable furniture that didn't feel institutional. Someone had thoughtfully provided toys, books, and art supplies to help children process their experiences through play and creativity. Jack was coloring in a book of superhero illustrations, his tongue poking out slightly in concentration as he carefully stayed within the lines of a picture showing Superman rescuing a group of children from a burning building. The symbolism was not lost on Hayes. Even in his art choices, Jack was gravitating toward stories of protection and rescue. Jack, Hayes said gently, crouching down to his eye level. Your mama is on the phone. She wants to talk to you. The boy's face lit up with the first genuine smile Hayes had seen from him, an expression that transformed his features and reminded her of how young he really was. Mama? Is she coming home? She is, sweetheart. She's going to drive all night to get here. Hayes handed him the phone, then stepped back to give him privacy, while still remaining close enough to intervene if needed. Mama! Jack's voice carried joy and relief in equal measure. The sound of a child who had been afraid his world was ending, suddenly discovering that salvation was possible. I was scared you wouldn't come back. George said maybe you like taking care of Grandma better than taking care of me. He said maybe it would be easier for everyone if I went to live with people who really wanted a little boy. Hayes felt another surge of anger at George Morrison's manipulation. Even if the trafficking plan had fallen through, the psychological damage he had inflicted on this child would take time to heal. The seeds of doubt and abandonment that George had planted would need to be carefully uprooted through therapy and consistent reassurance. No, baby, no. Linda's voice carried clearly through the phone, audible even from where Hayes stood. I love you more than anything in the world. You're my baby, my heart, and I'm never leaving you again. What George told you was a lie, honey. Terrible lies. While Jack talked to his mother, Hayes returned to the bullpen where Officer Bradley was printing out what appeared to be a substantial file from the FBI database. The printer was working overtime, churning out page after page of documentation that spoke to the scope and sophistication of the criminal enterprise they had stumbled into. Vincent Torino is a very bad man, Bradley said without preamble. handing her a thick stack of papers that was still warm from the printer. He's been on the FBI's radar for 3 years as a mid-level operator in a trafficking ring that specializes in what they call private adoptions. Wealthy clients who want children but don't want to deal with legal adoption procedures, background checks, waiting periods, or any of the safeguards that legitimate adoption agencies require. Hayes flipped through the file, her anger growing with each page. Torino's operation was sophisticated and far-reaching, with clients across the country and connections to similar rings internationally. The organization operated like a business with marketing materials, price lists, and customer service protocols that treated children like luxury commodities to be acquired and delivered according to buyer preferences. The going rate for healthy American children between the ages of 6 and 10 is between $40,000 and $60,000. Bradley continued, reading from his computer screen. Torino's organization provides complete identity packages, new birth certificates, medical records, even school transcripts. The children essentially disappear from their old lives and are inserted into new ones with families who have paid premium prices for them. What happens to the children who don't adapt well to their new situations? Hayes asked, though she dreaded the answer. Bradley's expression grew even more grim. According to the FBI file, children who cause problems or try to contact their original families often disappear entirely. The assumption is that they're either killed or sold into more exploitative situations, child labor, sexual exploitation, or simply abandoned when they become too much trouble to manage. The magnitude of what Patricia O'Brien had prevented by trusting her instincts was becoming clear. Jack Sullivan had not simply been saved from an unpleasant relocation. He had been saved from a life of captivity that might well have ended in death. The bus driver's split-second decision to keep driving had literally saved a child's life. "There's more," Bradley said, turning his computer screen so Hayes could see it. Torino's operation has been linked to 17 missing children cases across 6 states over the past 2 years. All of them were taken from families experiencing financial difficulties, and all of them had step-parents or guardians who subsequently claimed the children had run away or been abducted by strangers. Hayes studied the faces on the missing children database, seeing echoes of Jack Sullivan in each young face. These were not random abductions, they were carefully planned acquisitions, targeting children whose disappearances could be explained away by family dysfunction or teenage rebellion. The traffickers had perfected a system that allowed them to steal children in plain sight while providing plausible explanations that discouraged intensive investigation. "Look at this pattern," Bradley continued, pointing to a map on his screen that showed the locations of the missing children cases. They target small towns and suburban areas where families trust their neighbors and children have more freedom. Places like Millbrook, where people don't expect this kind of predatory behavior. The geographic pattern was telling. Rather than operating in urban areas where law enforcement might be more sophisticated and suspicious, the traffickers had focused on communities where people still believed in the basic goodness of their neighbors. They exploited the very trust and openness that made small towns attractive places to raise families. "We need to move fast," Hayes said, reaching for her phone. "If Morrison realizes that Jack didn't make the pickup, he's going to run. And if Torino's people think the operation has been compromised, they'll start destroying evidence and disappearing witnesses. We could lose our chance to save those other 17 children." She dialed the number for Captain Frank Reynolds, the commanding officer of the detective division. Reynolds answered on the first ring, his gravelly voice carrying the authority of 30 years in law enforcement and the wisdom that came from seeing humanity at both its best and its worst. "Captain, this is Hayes. That child endangerment case from this afternoon has turned into something much bigger. We're looking at a multi-state trafficking ring, and we need to coordinate with the FBI immediately." "How much bigger?" "Potentially dozens of missing children, organized trafficking operation with clients across the country, financial transactions in the hundreds of thousands of dollars." Hayes glanced at the evidence spread across her desk. "And we have a witness who can identify at least 2 of the operators, plus financial records that document the entire transaction. I'll make the calls. How soon can you have a complete briefing ready for federal agents?" "Give me 2 hours. But Captain, we need to move on the local arrests tonight. If we wait until morning, Morrison and his contacts are going to disappear, and we'll lose our chance to prevent other children from going through what Jack almost experienced." Agreed. I'll have patrol units standing by for arrest warrants as soon as you can get them drafted. And Hayes? Good work. That bus driver may have just broken open one of the largest trafficking cases we've ever seen. As Hayes hung up the phone, she felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with major case breaks. But underneath the professional excitement was a deeper current of anger. Anger at the adults who had failed to protect children, anger at a system that allowed such exploitation to flourish in plain sight, and anger at her own department for not recognizing the pattern sooner. She walked back to the family services room, where Jack was still talking quietly to his mother. The boy's posture had changed completely since the phone call began. His shoulders were no longer hunched defensively, and the fearful watchfulness had been replaced by something approaching normal childhood animation. He was actually laughing at something his mother had said, a sound that reminded Hayes why protecting children was worth any amount of professional disruption or personal risk. Detective Hayes, Maria Santos said quietly, I've been thinking about placement for Jack tonight. His mother won't arrive until tomorrow afternoon, and obviously he can't go back to the house on Elm Street. What are our options? I have a foster family that specializes in emergency placements for children in crisis situations. The Hendersons have been doing this for 10 years, and they're excellent at helping kids feel safe while they process trauma. They have experience with trafficking cases, so they understand the security concerns and the psychological support Jack will need. Hayes nodded, grateful for Maria's expertise. The last thing Jack needed was to be placed with well-meaning but unprepared caregivers who might inadvertently re-traumatize him. That sounds appropriate. Will they be able to handle the security concerns? We don't know if Morrison has other associates who might try to retrieve Jack. I'll coordinate with patrol to have periodic drive-bys of their house. The Hendersons live in a quiet neighborhood with good sight lines, so surveillance won't be difficult to maintain discreetly. They also have a security system and a large dog who's very protective of the children in their care. Jack finished his phone call and handed the receiver back to Hayes, his green eyes bright with tears that seemed to be equal parts relief and lingering fear. The conversation with his mother had clearly helped, but Hayes could see that it would take time for him to fully process what had happened and what it meant for his future. Mama's coming home, he said simply. She said she's never leaving me again, and that George was wrong about everything. She said she loves me more than all the stars in the sky. That's wonderful, Jack, Hayes replied, crouching down to his eye level again. And until she gets here, we're going to make sure you stay somewhere safe and comfortable. There's a nice family called the Hendersons who take care of children who need a place to stay for a few days. Are they nice? Jack asked, the question carrying all the wariness of a child who had learned that not all adults could be trusted. Will they try to give me away too? The question broke Hayes's heart, revealing how deeply George Morrison's betrayal had shaken Jack's fundamental sense of security. They're very nice, and they would never, ever give you away. Their job is to keep you safe until your mama gets here. They have a dog named Buddy who loves to play fetch, Maria Santos interjected, and Mrs. Henderson makes the best chocolate chip cookies in Millbrook. She always bakes a fresh batch for new children who come to stay with them. For the first time since the crisis began, Jack laughed, a sound that reminded Hayes why protecting children was worth any amount of professional disruption or personal risk. I like dogs, he said shyly. I've been asking Mama for a dog, but George said they're too much trouble and cost too much money. As evenings settled over Millbrook, the police station buzzed with activity that had nothing to do with the usual routine of minor crimes and traffic violations. Officers prepared arrest warrants, federal agents were en route from Boston, and somewhere in the growing darkness, George Morrison remained unaware that his carefully planned crime had been undone by a school bus driver's maternal instincts and an 8-year-old boy's courage to speak the truth. The investigation was far from over. There were other children to find, other traffickers to arrest, other families to reunite. But the most important victory had already been won. Jack Sullivan was safe, his mother was coming home, and a trafficking ring that had destroyed countless families was about to face the full weight of justice. In the family services room, Jack carefully colored a picture of Superman, his small hands steady now that he knew heroes, sometimes in the form of bus drivers and police detectives, really did exist in the world. The arrest of George Morrison took place at exactly 9:37 in the evening, as autumn darkness settled over the quiet streets of Millbrook like a heavy blanket. Detective Rachel Hayes sat in the passenger seat of an unmarked police cruiser, watching the pale yellow house at 47 Elm Street through night vision binoculars. The windows glowed with warm lamplight, creating an illusion of domestic tranquility that made the reality of what had almost happened within those walls even more disturbing. "Targets moving around inside," reported Officer Bradley from the driver's seat, his voice barely above a whisper despite the fact that they were parked 3 houses away. "Looks like he's in the kitchen, pacing back and forth. He's been on his phone for the past 10 minutes. Hayes adjusted her earpiece, listening to the coordinated chatter of the tactical team that had positioned itself around the Morrison house. 6 officers had taken strategic positions, 2 at the back door, 2 covering the side windows, and 2 preparing to approach the front entrance. The FBI agents who had driven up from Boston were monitoring the operation from a command vehicle parked around the corner, ready to take custody of George Morrison once the local arrest was complete. "All units, this is command," came the voice of Captain Reynolds through their radios. "Subject is to be considered potentially dangerous and definitely desperate. We have reason to believe he may attempt to flee or destroy evidence. Proceed with maximum caution." Hayes felt her heart rate increase as the moment of confrontation approached. In her 12 years as a detective, she had participated in dozens of arrests, but this one felt different. The stakes were higher, the implications broader, and the emotional weight of Jack Sullivan's near-miss with a horrific fate made every detail feel magnified and crucial. "Team Alpha, move in," Captain Reynolds commanded. Hayes watched through her binoculars as 2 officers approached the front door of 47 Elm Street, their movements careful and coordinated. The lead officer, Sergeant Mike Walsh, was a 20-year veteran with a reputation for calm professionalism, even in high-stress situations. His partner, Officer Lisa Chun, was newer to the force but had already proven herself capable in difficult circumstances. The sound of the doorbell echoed faintly across the quiet neighborhood, followed by the sharp barking of a dog from somewhere nearby. Hayes held her breath, waiting for George Morrison to answer the door and for this phase of the investigation to begin in earnest. It took nearly 2 minutes for the door to open, and when it did, George Morrison appeared in the doorway looking exactly like what he was. A man whose carefully constructed world was beginning to collapse around him. His graying hair was disheveled, his shirt wrinkled and partially untucked, and his eyes carried the wild, darting quality of someone who knew that his secrets were about to be exposed. "George Morrison?" Sergeant Walsh's voice carried clearly in the still night air. "Yes, that's me. Is something wrong? Has something happened to Linda? To Jack?" George's voice carried what sounded like genuine concern, the performance of a man who had not yet realized that his deception had been uncovered. "Mr. Morrison, I'm Sergeant Walsh with the Millbrook Police Department. We need to speak with you about Jack Sullivan. May we come in?" Hayes watched as George's body language shifted subtly, his shoulders tensing and his weight shifting backward as if preparing to flee. But after a moment's hesitation, he stepped aside and allowed the officers to enter his home. "He's inside," Bradley reported quietly. "Team Beta, maintain your positions. We don't want him slipping out the back." The next few minutes passed with agonizing slowness as Hayes waited for word from inside the house. She could see shadows moving past the windows, the silhouettes of the officers and George Morrison engaged in what she hoped would be a peaceful surrender. But she also knew that desperate people were capable of desperate actions, and George Morrison had already demonstrated that his moral boundaries were far more flexible than most people's. "Detective Hayes," came Sergeant Walsh's voice through her earpiece. "You need to get in here. Morrison is asking for a lawyer, but he's also making statements that you need to hear." Hayes and Bradley quickly exited their vehicle and approached the house, their footsteps crunching softly on the fallen leaves that carpeted the front walkway. The autumn air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of wood smoke from someone's fireplace and the earthy smell of decomposing leaves. It was the kind of evening that should have been peaceful, the kind of night when families gathered around dinner tables and children did homework while their parents watched television. Inside the house, George Morrison sat on a cream-colored sofa in what appeared to be the living room, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, and his face pale with the realization that his world had just ended. The room itself was pleasant and unremarkable. Family photos on the mantelpiece, a bookshelf filled with paperback novels and children's books, a coffee table scattered with magazines and remote controls. It looked like the home of ordinary people living ordinary lives, which made the extraordinary evil that had been planned within these walls even more chilling. "Mr. Morrison," Hayes said as she entered the room. "I'm Detective Hayes. I believe you know why we're here." George looked up at her with eyes that seemed to have aged years in the past few hours. "It's about Jack, isn't it? Something happened to Jack. I've been calling and calling, but no one would tell me where he is. The school said he never got home, but I was waiting. I was supposed to be waiting." The performance was impressive, Hayes had to admit. If she hadn't known what she knew, George Morrison's concern for his stepson might have seemed genuine. But knowing what she knew about his plans for Jack, his apparent distress felt more like the frustration of a criminal whose carefully laid plans had gone awry. "Jack is safe, Mr. Morrison. He's in protective custody, which is where he's going to stay while we sort out what you were planning to do to him." The color drained completely from George's face, and Hayes watched as the pretense finally crumbled. "I don't know what you think you know, but we know about Vincent Torino," Hayes interrupted, noting how George flinched at the name. "We know about the $25,000 down payment. We know about the planned pickup this afternoon. We know about the $50,000 sale price. Most importantly, we know about the 17 other children who have disappeared through Torino's network." George Morrison's shoulders sagged as if the weight of his crimes had suddenly become too heavy to bear upright. "You don't understand," he said quietly. "You don't understand what it's like to owe that much money to those kinds of people. They would have killed me. They were going to kill me. So you decided to sell your stepson instead." Hayes kept her voice level, professional, but she could feel her anger building. "An 8-year-old boy who trusted you, who looked to you for protection." "Jack never liked me anyway," George said, his voice taking on a defensive whine. "He never accepted me as his stepfather. Linda tried to make us bond, but he always resented me. He would have been better off with a family that really wanted him." The rationalization was breathtaking in its selfishness. Hayes had heard criminals justify their actions before, but the idea that George Morrison had convinced himself that selling Jack was somehow in the boy's best interest represented a level of self-deception that was almost pathological. "Tell me about Vincent Torino," Hayes said, settling into a chair across from the sofa. "When did you first make contact with his organization?" George was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. 6 months ago. I was at the casino and I'd lost everything. My savings, Linda's savings, money I'd borrowed against the house. I was sitting at the bar, probably looking like I was ready to jump off a bridge, when this man sat down next to me. Vincent Torino? No, someone who worked for him. Called himself Danny. Nice guy, seemed genuinely concerned about my situation. Bought me drinks, listened to my problems, acted like he really cared. George laughed bitterly. I should have known it was too good to be true. Nobody cares about a stranger's gambling debts unless they're looking to profit from them. Hayes made notes as George continued his confession, documenting each detail that might prove useful in building cases against other members of the trafficking network. The more he talked, the clearer it became that George Morrison had not stumbled into this crime accidentally. He had been carefully recruited and groomed by professionals who understood how to exploit human weakness. Danny told me about families who were looking for children to adopt but didn't want to deal with all the bureaucracy and waiting that comes with legal adoption. He said there were people willing to pay significant money for the right child, and that it would be a win-win situation for everyone involved. When did you first meet Vincent Torino? 2 weeks later. Danny arranged a meeting at a restaurant in Springfield. Torino was impressive. Expensive suit, nice car, talked like a businessman discussing a legitimate transaction. He asked me about Jack, how old he was, his health, his school performance, his personality. It felt like a job interview. Hayes felt sick listening to George describe the process of commodifying his stepson. What did Torino tell you about what would happen to Jack? He said Jack would be placed with a wealthy family who couldn't have children of their own. Somewhere warm, probably California or Florida. Private schools, college fund, opportunities one could never provide. George's voice grew defensive again. He made it sound like I was giving Jack a chance at a better life. And you believed that? George was quiet for several minutes, and when he finally answered, his voice was hollow. I wanted to believe it. I needed to believe it. Because if I didn't believe it, then what I was planning to do was unforgivable. The admission hung in the air like a physical weight. For the first time since his arrest began, George Morrison seemed to understand the true nature of what he had been planning. The psychological distance he had created through rationalization and self-deception was finally collapsing, leaving him face to face with the reality of his intended crime. Tell me about the financial arrangements, Hayes continued. $25,000 up front, $25,000 on delivery. Torino said it was standard procedure, half down to ensure I was serious, half on completion to ensure the child was delivered as promised. George's clinical description of the transaction made Hayes's skin crawl. The money was supposed to solve all my problems, pay off my gambling debts, give Linda and me a fresh start. But you gambled away most of the down payment. George nodded miserably. I thought I could win it back and more. I thought I could pay off my debts and still have money left over. But the more I lost, the more desperate I became to break even. What was supposed to happen this afternoon? Torino's people were supposed to pick up Jack at 4 o'clock. I was supposed to have him ready with a small suitcase of belongings and his important documents. They were going to drive him to what they called a transition facility, where he would stay for a few days while his new identity was prepared. Hayes felt her anger building as George described the planned kidnapping with the detached language of a business transaction. And you were going to tell Linda what, exactly? That Jack had run away while I was at work. I had it all planned out. I was going to call the police, file a missing person report, organize search parties. Torino's people even provided me with evidence to plant that would support the runaway story. The level of premeditation involved was staggering. This had not been a desperate, last-minute decision driven by immediate crisis. George Morrison had spent months planning every detail of how to make his stepson disappear while maintaining his own innocence and his wife's ignorance. Did Linda suspect anything? No. She trusted me completely. She felt guilty about leaving Jack with me to go take care of her mother, so she was grateful that I was willing to handle everything. George's voice carried a note of shame. She kept calling to check on us, worried that she was being a bad mother by leaving during a family crisis. I kept reassuring her that everything was fine, that Jack and I were finally bonding. The manipulation of Linda Sullivan's maternal guilt added another layer of cruelty to George's crime. He had not only planned to sell her son. He had used her love and concern for her dying mother as a weapon to create the opportunity for his betrayal. Mr. Morrison, Hayes said, leaning forward in her chair, I want you to understand something clearly. Vincent Torino's organization doesn't place children with loving families. They sell children to people who want to own them. Some of those children are forced into labor. Some are sexually abused. Some simply disappear when they become too much trouble to manage. You weren't giving Jack a better life. You were condemning him to hell. George Morrison began to cry. Not the dramatic sobs of someone seeking sympathy, but the quiet, hopeless tears of a man who finally understood the magnitude of what he had almost done. I told myself it would be different for Jack. I told myself that because he was young and healthy and smart, he would go to a good family. Based on what Torino told you? Based on what I needed to believe to live with myself. George wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. I know that sounds pathetic, but I was drowning. The gambling debts, the threats from loan sharks, the lies I had to tell Linda every day. I felt like selling Jack was the only way to save everything. Hayes stood up from her chair, her patience with George Morrison's self-pity finally exhausted. The only thing you were trying to save was yourself, and you were willing to destroy an innocent child to do it. Detective Hayes, Officer Bradley's voice came through her earpiece. We need you outside. The FBI wants to begin their interrogation, and Captain Reynolds wants to brief you on the search warrants." Hayes looked down at George Morrison, who had curled into himself on the sofa like a man trying to disappear. "Mr. Morrison, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit human trafficking, attempted kidnapping, and child endangerment. You have the right to remain silent, and I strongly suggest you exercise that right until you've spoken with an attorney." As the officers led George Morrison away in handcuffs, Hayes remained in the living room for a few more minutes, studying the family photographs that lined the mantelpiece. There was Linda Sullivan's wedding photo, showing her radiant with happiness next to a smiling George Morrison. There were pictures of Jack at various ages, birthday parties, Christmas mornings, school events. In every photo where George appeared with Jack, the boy's smile seemed forced, his body language subtly distant. Looking back with the knowledge she now possessed, Hayes could see signs that Jack had never fully trusted his stepfather. The way he positioned himself closer to his mother in group photos, the way his expressions grew more guarded when George was present, the subtle tension that even a camera had captured. Jack's instincts had been warning him long before his stepfather's true intentions became clear. Outside the house, the FBI agents were preparing to transport George Morrison to a federal facility where he would be interrogated about the broader trafficking network. Agent Sarah Coleman, the lead federal investigator on the case, approached Hayes as she exited the house. "Detective Hayes, excellent work on this case. Morrison's confession is going to be invaluable in building our case against Torino and his associates. What's the status on the search warrants? We've got teams hitting 5 locations simultaneously: Torino's house, his business office, 2 storage facilities, and a property in western Massachusetts that we believe may be one of their transition facilities." Agent Coleman checked her watch. "The raids should be starting in about 20 minutes. Hayes felt a surge of satisfaction at the thought of Vincent Torino's carefully constructed criminal empire beginning to crumble. But her satisfaction was tempered by the knowledge that 17 children were still missing, still trapped somewhere in the network that Jack Sullivan had so narrowly escaped. "What are the chances of finding those missing children?" "Better now than they were this morning," Agent Coleman replied. "Morrison's information, combined with the financial records you uncovered, gives us more leads than we've had in 3 years of investigation. And if we can flip some of Torino's lower-level associates, we might be able to locate the facilities where children are being held." As the evening progressed and the various law enforcement teams coordinated their activities, Hayes found herself thinking about Jack Sullivan, who was probably settling into his temporary placement with the Henderson family. The boy had no idea that his courage in speaking up had set in motion a chain of events that might ultimately save other children from the fate he had so narrowly avoided. The foster family had called to report that Jack was adjusting well, that he had eaten dinner and was currently reading a book about dogs while their golden retriever, Buddy, lay at his feet. It was a picture of normalcy that stood in stark contrast to the chaos that would have consumed his life if Patricia O'Brien had not trusted her instincts and kept driving that afternoon. By midnight, the raids had yielded a treasure trove of evidence. Computer files documenting transactions involving dozens of children, financial records showing payments to corrupt officials, and most importantly, information about current locations where missing children might be held. 3 arrests had been made in addition to George Morrison, and federal agents were working through the night to analyze the seized materials. Hayes sat at her desk, reviewing the initial reports from the various search locations, when her phone rang. The caller ID showed Linda Sullivan's number. "Detective Hayes, this is Linda Sullivan. I'm about 2 hours outside of Millbrook. Can you tell me how Jack is doing?" "He's doing well, Mrs. Sullivan. He had dinner with his foster family, and they say he's been asking a lot of questions about when you'll arrive." "Thank God." Linda's voice was thick with emotion. "I keep thinking about all the things that could have happened if that bus driver hadn't been paying attention. I don't know how I'll ever thank her. Patricia O'Brien is a remarkable woman. Her quick thinking and protective instincts saved your son's life." "Detective, can I ask you something? Do you think Jack will be okay? I mean, psychologically? He's been through so much and he's so young." Hayes considered her answer carefully. "Children are remarkably resilient, especially when they have strong support systems. Jack is going to need therapy to process what happened, and it may take time for him to fully trust adults again. But he has something that many traumatized children don't have. A mother who loves him unconditionally and will fight for him. I'm never leaving him again, Linda said firmly. I don't care what emergencies come up, what family obligations arise. Jack comes first, always. That's exactly what he needs to hear. As Hayes ended the call, she reflected on the day's events and their broader implications. A trafficking ring that had operated with impunity for years was now in the process of being dismantled. Children who had been given up for lost might soon be returned to their families. And at the center of it all was one 8-year-old boy who had found the courage to tell the truth when it mattered most. The investigation would continue for months, possibly years. There would be trials and appeals, testimony and evidence hearings. But the most important victory had already been achieved. Jack Sullivan was safe, his family was being reunited, and a network of predators was facing justice. In the quiet hours of the early morning, as Millbrook slept peacefully under a canopy of stars, Detective Rachel Hayes worked on her reports and thought about the fragile nature of childhood innocence and the extraordinary lengths that ordinary people would go to protect it. Patricia O'Brien would never know how many children her decision had ultimately saved, but Hayes would make sure that the bus driver understood the full magnitude of her heroism. Some victories in law enforcement were measured in arrests made and convictions secured. Others were measured in children saved and families preserved. Today had been a day for the latter, and Hayes felt grateful to have played a part in ensuring that one little boy's story would have a happy ending. 3 months later, the November morning dawned crisp and clear over Millbrook, Massachusetts, with frost glittering on the bare branches of oak trees like nature's own crystal chandelier. Patricia O'Brien adjusted her rearview mirror in bus 47, a gesture that had become both routine and deeply meaningful since that October afternoon when her maternal instincts had changed the course of several lives. The familiar weight of the steering wheel in her hands felt different now. Not heavier, exactly, but more significant, as if she carried with her the knowledge that every decision a person made could ripple outward in ways they might never fully understand. The courthouse in downtown Springfield was an imposing granite building that spoke of justice and permanence, its columns and steps worn smooth by decades of citizens seeking resolution to their conflicts and crimes. Inside courtroom 3B, Federal Judge Margaret Thompson had just sentenced George Morrison to 25 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. The gavel's final bang had echoed through the chamber like a period at the end of a very long, very dark sentence. Detective Rachel Hayes sat in the gallery, watching as George Morrison was led away in shackles. His transformation over the past 3 months had been remarkable and disturbing in equal measure. The nervous, fidgeting man who had tried to sell his stepson had been replaced by someone who seemed to have aged a decade in a matter of weeks. His hair had gone completely gray, deep lines had etched themselves around his eyes, and he carried himself with the defeated posture of a man who finally understood the magnitude of his crimes. During his testimony, George had provided crucial information that led to the dismantling of Vincent Torino's entire trafficking network. Torino himself was now serving life in federal prison, along with 12 associates whose criminal empire had stretched across 6 states and involved the trafficking of 43 children over a 4-year period. More importantly, 31 of those children had been recovered and returned to their families, while the remaining 12 had been confirmed deceased. A sobering reminder of the stakes involved in cases like these. The legal proceedings had been extensive and emotionally draining for everyone involved. Jack Sullivan, now 9 years old and living in a new apartment with his mother, had testified via closed-circuit television. His small voice steady and clear as he described the conversations he had overheard and the fear he had felt. His courage in speaking the truth had been instrumental in securing convictions not just against George Morrison, but against the entire network of traffickers who had preyed on vulnerable families. Linda Sullivan Morrison had filed for divorce within a week of George's arrest, reverting to her maiden name and moving herself and Jack to a comfortable 2-bedroom apartment on the other side of Millbrook. The house on Elm Street had been sold to pay legal fees and provide some measure of financial stability as Linda rebuilt their lives. She had found work as a nurse at Millbrook General Hospital, where her colleagues understood the trauma her family had endured and provided the kind of supportive work environment that allowed her to focus on healing. The ripple effects of that October afternoon had extended far beyond the courtroom and the criminal justice system. The town of Millbrook had rallied around the Sullivan family with the kind of community support that restored faith in human goodness. Local businesses had donated furniture for their new apartment. The school district had provided counseling services for Jack, and dozens of neighbors had simply shown up to offer practical help and emotional support. Patricia O'Brien had become something of a local hero, though she consistently deflected praise and insisted that she had simply done what any decent person would do under the circumstances. The school district had renamed their annual safety program the Patricia O'Brien Child Protection Initiative, and she had been invited to speak at conferences around the state about recognizing signs of child endangerment. But the recognition she treasured most was much simpler and more personal. Jack Sullivan had requested to continue riding Bus 47, even though his new apartment was closer to the school and within walking distance. Every morning at 7:45, he would be waiting at the bus stop on Maple Street, his backpack neat and his smile genuine as he climbed the familiar steps. He had chosen to sit in the front row now, where he could see everything ahead and maintain easy conversation with Miss Patty during their daily journey. Their relationship had evolved into something special, not quite family, but deeper than the typical connection between a bus driver and her passengers. Jack had become Patty's unofficial assistant, helping her with attendance checks and reminding younger children about safety rules. He had also developed an encyclopedic knowledge of the bus's mechanical systems, asking detailed questions about engine maintenance and fuel efficiency that reminded Patty of the curious boy he had been before fear had clouded his natural wonder about the world. The psychological healing had been gradual but steady. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the child psychologist who had worked with Jack since that first night at the police station, reported remarkable progress in his ability to trust adults and process the trauma he had experienced. The nightmares that had plagued him initially had faded, replaced by dreams about normal childhood, concerns like school tests and soccer games. Jack had joined the school chess club, where his strategic thinking and patient approach to problem-solving had made him one of the strongest players in his age group. His teacher, Miss Rebecca Foster, noted that he had become something of a protector for younger students, always alert to signs that someone might be struggling or afraid. The experience of being vulnerable had given him an unusual sensitivity to the needs of others, transforming what could have been a purely traumatic experience into a source of empathy and strength. Linda Sullivan had also found her way to healing, though her journey had been more complex. The guilt she felt about leaving Jack with George Morrison had taken months to process, even with professional counseling and the constant reassurance of friends and family. She had struggled with questions about her judgment, her ability to protect her son, and her capacity to trust her own instincts about the people in their lives. But gradually, with the help of therapy and the visible evidence of Jack's recovery, Linda had begun to forgive herself. She had come to understand that George Morrison's ability to deceive her was not a reflection of her failures as a mother, but rather evidence of his skill as a manipulator who had specifically targeted her vulnerabilities. The support group for families affected by trafficking that she had joined had provided her with connections to other parents who understood the unique challenges of rebuilding trust and security after such a profound betrayal. The financial settlement from the sale of the Elm Street house had provided Linda and Jack with stability and options. She had established a college fund for Jack and purchased a reliable car that gave her independence and the ability to take Jack to his various activities and appointments. More importantly, she had learned to listen to her instincts in ways she never had before, developing the kind of protective awareness that came from understanding how predators operated and what signs to watch for. The broader impact of the case had extended well beyond Millbrook. The FBI had used the information gathered from George Morrison's confession and the subsequent arrests to identify and dismantle similar trafficking networks in other states. The case had become a textbook example of how community vigilance and law enforcement cooperation could combine to protect vulnerable children and bring sophisticated criminals to justice. Patricia O'Brien had been invited to testify before a congressional subcommittee about child protection and the role that ordinary citizens could play in preventing trafficking. Her testimony, delivered in her characteristic no-nonsense style, had emphasized the importance of trusting maternal instincts and taking action when something felt wrong, even if that action disrupted normal routines or created temporary inconvenience. "I've been driving school buses for 16 years, she had told the assembled congressmen and women. And in all that time, I've learned that children don't lie about being afraid. When a child is genuinely scared, there's always a reason. And it's our job as adults to find out what that reason is and fix it. Her words had been quoted extensively in news coverage of the trafficking case and had become something of a rallying cry for child protection advocates. But Patty herself remained focused on the practical, daily work of keeping children safe during their twice-daily journeys to and from school. The morning routine on Bus 47 had settled into a comfortable rhythm that honored both the ordinary needs of transportation and the extraordinary bond that had been forged through crisis. Jack Sullivan sat in his front row seat, his homework completed and his lunch packed by a mother who now checked and double-checked every detail of his daily schedule. He had grown taller over the past 3 months. His voice was beginning to show the first hints of adolescent change, and his confidence had returned stronger than before. "Miss Patty," Jack said as they pulled away from his stop on Maple Street, "my mom wanted me to invite you to Thanksgiving dinner next week. She's cooking a turkey and making her famous sweet potato pie." Patty glanced at him in the rearview mirror, noting the easy smile and relaxed posture that had replaced the tense wariness she remembered from October. "That's very kind of your mama, honey. I'd be honored to join you. She says you're family now," Jack continued matter-of-factly, "because family is the people who protect you when you need it most." The simple wisdom of those words, coming from a 9-year-old who had learned more about human nature than most adults ever would, brought tears to Patty's eyes. She had spent 16 years transporting other people's children, caring for them during their daily journeys, but she had never experienced the depth of connection that had developed with Jack Sullivan. "Your mama is a smart woman," Patty replied, her voice thick with emotion, "and you're a pretty smart boy yourself." As Bus 47 continued its route through the familiar streets of Millbrook, other children climbed aboard with their own stories and struggles, their own needs for safety and protection. Emma Rodriguez still sat in her favorite seat and chatted excitedly about her upcoming birthday party. The Wilson sisters continued their daily whispered conversations about horses and homework. Nathan Thompson had graduated to more sophisticated handheld gaming devices but still forgot to put them away when the bus reached school. Each child represented a sacred trust, a responsibility that Patty had always taken seriously but now understood with even greater clarity. The events of that October afternoon had reminded her that the job of protecting children belonged to all adults, not just parents and teachers and police officers. It belonged to bus drivers and store clerks, to neighbors and strangers, to anyone who happened to be in the right place at the right time with the courage to act on their instincts. The Millbrook Police Department had established a new protocol based on the Sullivan case, requiring all reports of suspicious activity around children to be investigated immediately rather than filed for later follow-up. Detective Hayes had been promoted to sergeant and had taken charge of a specialized unit focused on identifying and preventing human trafficking. The case had become a model for other law enforcement agencies, demonstrating how local police work could intersect with federal investigations to achieve results that neither could accomplish alone. But perhaps the most significant change had been in the community itself. Parents were more vigilant about monitoring their children's activities and relationships. Teachers had received additional training in recognizing signs of abuse and trafficking. Neighbors had become more engaged in watching out for each other's children, understanding that the safety of all children was everyone's responsibility. The annual Halloween parade in Millbrook had taken on special significance that year, with Jack Sullivan serving as one of the honorary grand marshals alongside Patricia O'Brien and Detective Hayes. The three of them had ridden together on a float decorated to look like a school bus, waving to crowds of families who understood that they were celebrating not just a holiday, but a victory of community vigilance over predatory evil. Jack had dressed as a police detective for Halloween, complete with a badge and notepad, telling anyone who asked that he wanted to help other kids the way Detective Hayes had helped him. His costume choice had been both touching and encouraging, evidence that his experience, while traumatic, had not destroyed his faith in the ability of good people to protect those who needed protection. As the school year progressed, Jack's academic performance had improved dramatically. The anxiety and distraction that had characterized his work during the early part of the previous year had been replaced by focus and enthusiasm. His teachers reported that he was particularly drawn to subjects involving problem-solving and logical thinking, and that he often volunteered to help classmates who were struggling with difficult concepts. The chess club had become Jack's primary social outlet, providing him with a structured environment where his analytical skills could flourish and where he could build friendships based on shared interests rather than shared trauma. His chess coach, Mr. David Park, noted that Jack approached the game with unusual maturity, always thinking several moves ahead and showing remarkable patience in developing long-term strategies. Linda Sullivan had found her own path to healing through volunteer work with organizations that supported families affected by trafficking and other forms of child exploitation. Her nursing background and personal experience had made her a valuable advocate for victims, and she had become a frequent speaker at training sessions for healthcare providers who might encounter trafficking victims in their work. The relationship between Linda and Patricia O'Brien had developed into a genuine friendship based on mutual respect and shared commitment to Jack's well-being. They spoke regularly by phone, coordinated their efforts to support Jack's various activities, and had developed the kind of partnership that allowed them to provide consistent care and guidance across different aspects of his life. "Miss Patty," Jack said as they approached the school, "I've been thinking about what I want to be when I grow up." "Oh? And what's that, sweetie?" "I think I want to be a police detective like Sergeant Hayes so I can help kids who are scared like I was. But I also think maybe I want to be a bus driver like you so I can keep kids safe while they're traveling." Patty smiled at the ambition in his voice, the sense of purpose that had emerged from his experience. "Well, you've got plenty of time to figure that out. Maybe you can do both. Be a detective who rides around in a school bus solving crimes." Jack laughed at the image, and the sound filled the bus with warmth and joy. It was the laugh of a child who had faced real danger and emerged stronger, who had learned that evil existed in the world, but had also learned that there were people willing to fight against it. As Bus 47 pulled into the circular driveway at Millbrook Elementary School, Jack gathered his backpack and prepared to begin another day of learning and growth. His mother would pick him up after school for his weekly appointment with Dr. Walsh, and then they would go grocery shopping for ingredients for the Thanksgiving dinner that would include not just family but the broader community of people who had helped them through their darkest time. "Have a great day, honey," Patty called as Jack descended the bus steps. "You too, Miss Patty. See you this afternoon." As Jack walked toward the school building, his posture confident and his step light, Patty felt the deep satisfaction that came from knowing she had made a difference in a young life. The events of that October afternoon had reminded her why she had chosen to work with children in the first place. Not just because they needed safe transportation, but because they needed adults who would pay attention, who would listen, and who would act with courage when action was required. The morning sun climbed higher over Millbrook, casting long shadows across the school parking lot and warming the autumn air. In classrooms throughout the building, children were beginning their daily lessons, safe in the knowledge that the adults around them were watching out for their welfare. It was the kind of ordinary miracle that happened every day in communities where people understood that protecting children was not just a professional responsibility but a moral imperative. Patricia O'Brien shifted Bus 47 into gear and began the journey back through town, ready to pick up the next group of children who needed safe passage to their destinations. In the rearview mirror, she could see Jack Sullivan disappearing through the school's front doors, carrying with him the confidence and resilience that would serve him well in all the adventures and challenges that lay ahead. The radio crackled to life on her dashboard, the dispatcher's voice cutting through the morning quiet with routine announcements about schedule changes and weather conditions. But Patty was only half listening, her attention focused on the road ahead and the precious cargo she would soon be carrying. Every child represented a story, a future, a possibility that deserved protection and nurturing. As Bus 47 rounded the corner onto Elm Street, Patty glanced briefly at the house that had once been home to Jack Sullivan and George Morrison. New owners had moved in the previous month, a young couple with a toddler who played in the front yard while his parents worked in the garden. The yellow paint had been refreshed, the front steps had been repaired, and the shadows of the past had been replaced by the bright promise of new beginnings. It was, Patty reflected, exactly as it should be. Evil might touch a place, but it didn't have to define it. Darkness might fall, but morning always came. And children like Jack Sullivan could face the worst that humanity had to offer and still emerge with their capacity for joy and hope intact. The last stop home, it turned out, was not a place at all. It was the moment when a community came together to protect its most vulnerable members, when ordinary people found extraordinary courage, and when the simple act of paying attention became an act of heroism that rippled outward in ways that might never be fully measured but would certainly never be forgotten. In the distance, the spire of the Millbrook police station rose above the tree line, a symbol of safety and justice in a world that sometimes seemed short on both. But on this November morning, in this small New England town, there was reason for hope and gratitude. The children were safe, the predators were behind bars, and the bus was ready for whatever journey lay ahead.